let's get back into Jared Diamond again. And to sort of enter into the complexity of the process that he's trying to analyze, he asks what we could say is something of a new question, which is um, how exactly did certain wild plants get turned into crops? But before he can go there, he says, look, you have to really understand what the process of domestication entails. So he then clearly states plant domestication entails growing a plant and causing it to change from its wild ancestors to make it more useful to humans, to human consumption. And most of this is done unwittingly, unconsciously. Again, part of his point that, trying to really understand history from the point of the view of the person in the moment who doesn't know the future, which is always the challenge of the historian to try and replicate what it must have been, what they what the actors in history must have experienced in a specific moment, not knowing the end result of what they're going to do. Right? They're just like us. The future is open ended, invisible. And in that sense, they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know that this is going to end up with plants that will morph and change and become more useful to us, but rather that this day by day series of choices, right? Okay. So he has to begin with a question, which is what made some plants easier to domesticate than others, right? And he does something that I think is nice. He says, okay, let's look at the process of domestication from the point of view of the plants. Not that the plants themselves were conscious per se, but it sort of opens up a new vista for us, a new way of understanding it, right? And so he says that one of the challenges that plants face is not only must they produce seeds, which will then, once they germinate, pass on the genetic material of the parent plant, but they also need to spread the seeds further away to enable that practice to come to fruition, if I may use that word right now, right? Um, so, uh, one of the interesting distinctions that he's making here is the distinction between the seed itself and the fruit. And so those fruits that we eat that have seeds in them, uh, they represent part of the complex evolutionary response of plants to the challenge of how you spread the seeds. And here he gets into the nitty gritty of um, why fruits ripen, and when they ripen, why they taste better and smell attractive, these kinds of things, so that indeed they can attract carriers of the seeds. And according to the fruit that we're talking about, different branches of nature may intervene to eat the fruit, swallow it, swallow the seeds. The seeds do not break down in the intestines, and they get defecated out at a certain point in time, so that animals unwittingly can become carriers of the seeds and propagate this process of reproduction across generations and spreading the seeds into new areas. Um, the example he gives is, for example, wild strawberries. And wild strawberries, before the seeds are ready, are green and bitter, and they don't attract a lot of attention. However, once they ripen, and in ripening, the seeds inside are ripened and ready to be planted to continue the process, they then turn red. The color attracts attention, plus the smell. Um, Insects can come and eat them, and other wild animals, birds, can come across them and eat them, right? Um, think of acorns in the same fashion, right? Once they are ready, they attract the attention of squirrels, right? Now, you could say the relationship between the squirrel and the acorn is similar to the relation between humans, and whatever crop we're talking about, humans and wheat, humans and corn. The one difference is the squirrel is not intentionally planting the acorn seeds to create future trees. It is doing that to hide food for itself that it can uncover later on, when it gets cold, it doesn't have any food, right? These kinds of things, right? So that, in effect, even though that kind of behavior by animals, is not true domestication in the definition that we've spoke to, from the point of view of the plant, assuming the plant had a true consciousness and point of view, it is doing the same thing. As I, year after year, have to go out on the lawn and pluck up the baby, um, oak trees that are springing from the planting of acorns all over my lawn by those damn squirrels that are out there working hard, right? Um, so he said, okay, moving on from that, looking back at the human interaction here, um, we have to answer the question of which seeds are chosen, um, and what are, if you will, um, what are the unconscious criteria that we use to choose those fruits that we prefer to eat, right? And he runs through a series of them. They're pretty straightforward. The first one is size. Um, if you go out picking wild blueberries, they appear to be minuscule compared to what we get in today's, um, carefully grown blueberries that can be 3, 4, 5 times as big, as the largest blueberry you can find in a wild blueberry bush. So size is important, and size will attract attention of humans and others who are eating fruit in the wild. Um, Tastiness. And again, nature has sort of, intervened here in the process of evolution in this regard, such that when many of these fruits are not yet ripe, hence have not yet achieved the state in which the seeds are ready to be taken and planted elsewhere, they have a degree of bitterness. He gives us the example, of almonds, which actually contain potentially, a poisonous substance that's used to make cyanide. And how is it then that, indeed, given the fact that the bitterness is so extreme, and occasionally from a bag of almonds, which I really do like to eat, occasionally I'll come across one which strikes me as rather bitter, and I think of what I've read here at this book, and I said, uh, you know, uh, how do they ensure that the ones that they are putting in the bags come from, the right trees? He then goes on to, in effect, address the issue of, well, if indeed, almonds are so bitter by nature, how is it that we have bothered to domesticate them, and eaten them in the fashion that we do? Uh, And he talks about the process of mutation in nature, such that um, nature will promote genetic mutations, uh, one of which, in this case, actually uh, produces fruit without the bitter taste at all. It turns off the capacity um, in the tree to generate that form of fruit, that form of uh, nut seed with this in it, right? So we look for size, we look for tastiness, we look for fleshy, seedless fruits. And he refers to a number of them that come out that way. And he says something interesting again. Seedlessness is a good example of how human selection, choice, um, can reverse um, uh, the original function of wild fruit, which indeed were a vehicle for dispersing seeds. And as early humans increasingly chose to, you know, plants that were seedless, right? Um, all these were things that farmers could notice as they went out about the process of choosing what fruit to um, to choose. I mean, put yourself in the place of a group of hunter gatherers going out into a new environment with plants and fruits and vegetables that you don't know, leafy things, grains. How do you know what is edible and what's not edible? I suppose one thing you can do is you can watch other animals, right? If the monkeys are eating a fruit, it probably isn't poisonous to you. You might then be tempted to try it, right? But again, given the fact that the taste could indicate the presence or absence of noxious elements in the fruit itself, right? But I mean, put yourself in and he's trying to sort of reproduce for us. But again, he's looking at something a little bit different. And I think my example is probably off base here because he's really looking at the shift from wild fruits and vegetables to the growing of crops, right? And what he's talking about is um, in selecting to plant seeds for future crops, he's looking at the elements that would attract attention such that you set aside the seeds from the largest X, Y, and Z if size is important. Seeds from the tastiest variety of something if taste is obviously important, right? These kinds of factors will influence you, right? Um, okay, so he then comes along with four major types of natural factors that are involved in the choices themselves, right? Um, these are not things that, as he says, the first ones are things that are obvious, the size of the fruit, taste of the fruit, it's obvious to everyone, right? Um, whether it's fleshy and less seeds versus some with more seeds and less fruit involved with it, right? These are all things that are visible, tangible in a sense. Then he goes on that there may be natural elements that are also influencing the process of choice, if you will. Along with the natural mechanisms for seed dispersal, um, uh, are is the fact that in a number of different varieties, he cites peas that come in a pod, um, rice. I've heard similar kinds of things. I've read similar kinds of things about rice too. And so there are a number of, say, plants out there in the wild that face the challenge of if my seeds all fall together at the base of the plant, then the next season will come and they'll all compete with each other and probably kill each other out, right? What we need to do is take my seeds and scatter them, right? Well, how are you going to do that? Well, we've seen one way of doing that is having um, bright, tasty fruit get eaten by animals who defecate it and leave it in their droppings here, there, and everywhere, right? But something like rice, something like wheat, barley, they have mechanisms that sort of shoot the seed out when it's ready, right? Now, if it's gonna, if that's going to happen at the point when rice is fully ripe and ready to be harvested, when you get there, you're going to find not a lot of rice left on the stem, right? And indeed, you're going to be looking for plants that do have plenty of rice left on the stem. Here again, the question of mutation comes in with the rice, with the wheat, with the barley, right? Such that there are um, mutant varieties, genetically different varieties that appear spontaneously that do not do that, right? What that means is when you go out in the field to harvest wild rice or wild wheat, what are you going to find? You're going to find indeed the varieties, those mutant varieties that do not send their seeds out to be propagated all over the place, right? And so they're the seeds that you're going to start bringing back as a hunter gatherer, and they will constitute then the seeds that you will plant increasingly. Even if it's you cut branches off sheaves of wheat, and the same thing, pea pods when you bring them in. There may be some that are half open, and you keep all the peas. And so increasingly, you will plant varieties that do not open up and disperse the seeds, right? In doing that, you make them the dominant variety. The mutation now has replaced the initial natural form with one that responds better to cultivation by humans for human consumption. The second thing is the question of germination inhibitors. And so this involves defense mechanisms that plants have created, often plants that live in dry areas. So I worked in Saudi Arabia for 5 years. I was an English teacher there, and we lived on a base that the company had. Later, we were given an apartment elsewhere, but um, we would drive to work in a bus from the base. And along the way, it was it wasn't desert in the sense of sand desert. It was desert in the sense that it hardly ever rained. So it was very dry. If it should rain, and it would just take one rain, the desert would explode and blossom with plants and flowers and these kinds of things. And it would last like that and come to fruition 6, 7, 8 weeks later, maybe even 5 weeks, right? While you had suddenly this beautiful verdant vista on all sides, where before you'd been going through this rock and sand and desert and, you know, and gnarly old trees with thorns on them, stuff like that. And suddenly there are flowers, poppies blooming and whatever, right? And that's that phenomena where these plants have adapted to this situation such that the rain comes, they germinate, they grow, they flower, they have seeds, and those seeds drop to the ground. But those seeds in those particular plants have over time developed by the laws of natural selection, to the point where only those plants that had that capacity to wait 20, 30, 40 years for rain to come, right? Or even 3, 5, 7 years for the rain to come, right? Only those plants would survive the intervening period of time waiting, such that when the rains came, they germinate, they grow, they flower, and they do it again, right? This uh, can be something, right? But at the same time, there will be plants, even though that plant in general may have developed this kind of defense mechanism, there will be mutations of plants that don't have that, are not born with that protective coating that will seal them against insects and the wind and the cold so that they can survive until the water comes to signal that it's time to open up and blossom again. There will be other seeds that fall to the ground, and to the extent that they lack the protectiveness of their cousins, they don't last. Okay, but this is a periodic mutation. Now, when you have this, just like with the rice or the peas or something like that, the mutant form, the mutated form, is what hunter gatherers will gather, bring in, and then seed that, such that increasingly they move away from the variety that was the origin and create almost a genetically different variation on the theme itself. Finally, he talks about natural selection. So this is again, these are mechanisms that are natural, that are not man-made or man-constructed. And so in Darwin's idea of natural selection, ultimately it is the environment itself that creates the criteria for judging what survival by the fittest would mean. And so, where some seeds, uh, some seeds would be more suited to a difficult life in difficult terrain. Um, they may be smaller, less demanding. Larger seeds quickly, wilt before they have a chance to bloom and produce. Whereas when you take the larger seeds into that new environment that the farmer creates, where he tills the soil, he provides them with water, he weeds out competitors, it is the largest seed that then propagates better in that specific context, that particular environment, right? So even though it's not exactly humans who are choosing which seed will succeed, nature itself will use the way that humans convert the environment to give them advantage. Now, on page 120 in the text, um, again, he gives another interesting chart, which again shows how regions combined locally domesticated crops with crops from elsewhere. And so once food production begins, um, either as an independent choice or because um, founder crops have come in to promote it. Once the process is up and running, individuals in different areas who may have taken wheat from here and barley from there and this kind of a thing begin to look around their own environment and say, well, can we do the same thing with this, right? And they may begin domesticating plants that are really native to their own local region, but the process of food production has been stimulated by the introduction of founder crops from elsewhere. Okay. Uh, the So, having reviewed the challenges that early farmers had to face in domesticating individual plants, he then asks, okay, why didn't food production arise in certain fertile areas that today are sort of like California, for example? Why didn't it arise there? California, Europe, Australia, Africa, below the equator, Australia on the southwest coast, right? Why is it that these areas that have this um, today we can see an ideal environment for food growing? Why didn't they occur? Then the second question: why did it develop earlier in some areas than others? So he says there are two contrasting explanations from this. One would situate the problem, if you will, the obstacle, the obstruction, with local people. Perhaps cultural elements, who knows, right? So um, the obstacle resides in the obstinacy, stupidity, whatever, of local people, or the problems reside in the amount and type of locally available wild plants, right? That and then he goes on to suggest that look, if we're looking at a large enough population, right, and even if there are cultural taboos about growing foods or something like that, right, um, with a broad enough range of people, you're going to find people who are going to experiment with this, right? And so it's probably not the people themselves. It may have to do with some sort of objective factors in the environment, right? So he goes on to say that there are 200,000 species of flowering plants. Um, which seems to be an immense amount, and it would make it almost impossible for us to determine in any one area whether there were or weren't sufficient and adequate plants available to begin the process, right? But he then goes on to reduce that number. He says, first of all, the vast majority are simply uh, unsuitable for human consumption. They are literally inedible. Okay. If they grow into trees and have wood and bark and things like that, and only a few thousand are indeed eaten by humans. Then, of that few thousand, only a few hundred have been domesticated. And only a few, then, of those that have been domesticated provide adequate nutrition. Um, uh, Most, then, of the plants from this huge natural storehouse um, are effectively uh, provide, only a few provide adequate nutrition. Um, most of most of them, of this reduced number, most of them only provide inadequate, are indeed inadequate alone to support the rise of civilization. So if we were to go into a place like California and find that there had been native X, Y, and Z, right? That one thing alone, as a wild species, would not have provided the adequate basis for the lifestyle that farming demands, right? And so that is one of the things that you have to look at is the presence there of uh, foodstuffs in the wild that are capable of being domesticated, and are there enough of them there, right? Okay, so he then goes on to say, look at today's world. Effectively, a mere dozen plants provide 80% of the world's tonnage of crops annually. Cereals alone, like wheat, barley, rice, alone provide more than 50% of the world's annual caloric intake. So when you look at how it has been restricted down to a small handful of plants, you begin to understand the challenges facing other places that didn't have any wild examples of those specific plants. Um, the question then becomes, how do we assess the potential of an entire local flora for domestication? So he goes on to review three regions, as a point of comparison. The Fertile Crescent, that area that stretches around from Lebanon along the coast, then into the interior, around into the mountains of the Zagros Mountains, and loops back down again. The Fertile Crescent, the island of New Guinea, and the eastern portion of the United States, right? In the Fertile Crescent, you had Mediterranean climate, which is entailed by wet winters, followed by hot, dry summers. So I did research in the south of Spain, where this is totally true. And I was looking at the wine industry. And so I was lucky enough to be in a town that had all of the elements of wine industry, from the fields to the factories, you know. And so I was able to, one day go out with a farmer to his grape orchard, right? And one of my friends was sort of poor. He also suffered something that when you see it, you understand that he had no sons. So he was already in his 50s, almost 60 years old, and he'd have to get up every day and go out to the fields and work very, very hard in the fields because it's hard work, right? And the way he used to do it is you get up at 5 in the morning, so you're out there at the first crack of dawn, and because that's the best time to work. It's coolest, right? And he would work till maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, by which time it was getting beastly hot. Okay, and he had a little shack in the fields. He'd go in, he'd lie down, he'd sleep for 3-4 hours after he ate his lunch, right? Okay, then get up in the evening, go back out and finish working out there when the sun had sort of hadn't gone down, but and so he'd end up coming back to the town after dark. A lot of the farmers did this, right? And I could see what he's talking about. They have so in the Fertile Crescent, and indeed in southern Spain, you have this obviously Mediterranean climate with wet winters, long hot summers. This type of a climate selects for plant species able to survive summers and come to life again with the appearance of rains at the start of the winter. And what's of significance here, looking not at Spain now, but at the Fertile Crescent at the other end of the Mediterranean, this climate produces annuals. And annuals are plants that grow from a seed, flourish, flower, and then die at the end after they come to seed themselves, right? And what's important here is these are not plants that are going to grow and flourish across time, say like the grapevines. So the grapevines, when they ultimately die, have got, a trunk that's, about so big, right? Okay, gnarly with, branches coming out, right? Kind of a thing. And what he's saying is with those kind of plants, like olive trees or olives or something like that, they waste a lot of the energy, the growth energy, um, whereby the roots extract from the soil nutrients, the leaves capture the energy of the sun. It's all put together with the moisture that is sucked out of the ground, right? Much of that growth energy goes to creating the root structure, which will, continue to feed the plant. the growth of trunks, you know, growth of a lot of stuff, while necessary for the life of the plant, is not something that contributes directly to human consumption, right? Whereas for the most part, then, these annuals dedicate most of their force and strength to producing larger and larger seeds to propagate themselves year after year. And it's the seeds that we eat, right? So many of these big seed plants and their seeds are indeed edible by humans. Indeed, of this, 6 of them constitute um, the part of the 12 major crops in the modern world. So if you take wheat, barley, rice, corn, right, sorghum, and there's one other there I can't think of right now, but these literally constitute the brunt of what we eat in terms of caloric intake around the world at large, right? And hence, um, okay, so these were available. These were available. So the second thing he talks about is that in the Fertile Crescent, these were available in superabundance. And indeed, in fact, from our reconstruction of what it might have been like, and given its importance as probably the first area to indeed foster the independent growth of food production, it has received a lot of attention from students of the process, right? When you go there, then you will see that um, there are still today many of the wild ancestors uh, um, that were extremely plentiful and abundant at a point in time when the hunter gatherers were collecting them directly. Um, their value as a food source would have been clear and obvious to the hunter gatherers who were already using them before they started domesticating them. Indeed, to the point, their their abundance was such that they actually permitted the growth of permanent villages before they began to cultivate plants, right? So this is an initial and an extremely important advantage that the Fertile Crescent had. Um, the third advantage, then, um, the reproductive systems of these plants was um, uh, such that it was very convenient for farmers to go from the wild seeds to planting them and growing them. Right. Um, this would have been another advantage that the Fertile Crescent had over other regions. Right. Um, it also was the world's largest zone of Mediterranean climate, which then promoted this high diversity of plants and animal species more than other areas with similar climates. So, in other words, what he's saying is to understand the reason why the Fertile Crescent was the first area, there are indeed underlying objective factors in nature that would have sort of promoted the growth of population, promoted interaction then between humans as hunter gatherers and the wild ancestors of modern wheat, rye, barley, these kinds of things, as well as animals, sheep and goats were both available in the region itself for domestication. Um, Furthermore, he goes on to say, the Fertile Crescent experiences the greatest climatic diversity of the different regions that he's suggested. Um, and this favors annuals. Um, Combining then these two factors gives us those two factors the large zone and the greatest diversity of climate, um, and enables uh, increases the annuals that existed there and the highest diversity of annual plants anywhere around. So in other words, he's bringing together a variety of factors that contribute and make Fertile Crescent the ideal site to begin this process, right? Um, okay, so to summarize this, what he's going to suggest is there are a number of objective factors that make the Fertile Crescent simply um, a better place to begin this process. Why? Because um, there have been hunter gatherers living in the zone that are aware of um, the nutritional value of a variety of plants that are the ancestors, the wild ancestors of some of the most important plants in the contemporary food locker. There are also a diversity of animals there, many of which, like sheep and goats, will become critical elements in the domestication, right? Bring these factors together, and we see that the Fertile Crescent was sort of gifted by nature in a fashion that once they started the process, there was a strong sort of natural basis for this process to come to fruition. Do the same analysis in parts of California. Do the same analysis in New Guinea. Do the same analysis in the eastern United States, and you will see that while they may have indeed ultimately domesticated a plant or two in the environment, when you look at what they were able to contribute, it would not have been sufficient for them to base a food production lifestyle on. Hence, they do not until other founder crops come in that then lay the basis for that explosion of civilization and the beginning of domestication of plants, particularly in the environment, that can then supplement but are still subordinate to the crops that were produced elsewhere. Okay, so hopefully I will finish this with one more lecture so we can cover the book. It is a little bit complex to read, but I think it's really interesting and provides you a different point of view of history, particularly when you're looking deep into the past. Okay, thank you very much.